So I'm hoping that we can have a little bit of a conversation. Several of the members of the network submitted some questions, and they're curious to hear from both of you about some of these issues. As the video illustrated, we're launching 10 networks with diverse members focused on pressing issues related to health equity. And we believe that having strong intersectoral partnerships, such as the ones that you described in your remarks, as well as an active community voice is critical to sustaining change. And I'm wondering how important community members' voices and community coalitions are to your decision-making process as you move forward to address some of the challenges. And maybe, Mayor Lightfoot, you can start.
Well, I think they're essential. Mayor Tory and I were talking about this earlier today. You can come up with the best solution that you think is going to work, but if people don't feel like their voices are heard, that they haven't been along the journey, then the end result isn't going to have any legitimacy. I know that from the work that I've done in local policing, but I particularly know that work in the 10 months since I've been mayor. People want to feel like they're heard. So I talked before about our Invest Southwest. We are intentional in going into communities. We had 10 different forums. We engage people in a very proactive way to help them think about how they could design what these investments would look like, and the feedback has been overwhelming. We had over 2,000 people come to these 4 different forums, and what we hear is people knocking on the door saying, hey, what about us? So whatever we produce, because we're co-curating it with people and reflecting what their community needs are, the result is something that's going to be better. And I really believe, particularly when we talk about building healthy communities, it's got to be about building capacity in those communities, so folks are feeling like they are really controlling their own destiny. So bottom line is, it's essential for everything that we do.
Thank you. Mayor Tory, did you want to jump in here?
Crucially important. I think of the things that work well in this city. I was telling the mayor today about the Waterfront Corporation, and I used to think, before I was mayor, that it was a very slow-moving kind of organization that didn't get anything done fast enough. And in fact, there were those who sort of said it should be done away with because it was sort of so slow and got nothing done. And I realized once I got to office that the reason that they were a bit slower moving was because they spent so much time talking to people about the waterfront, what the waterfront should be and what it shouldn't be, and what the form of development and so on should take place there. And so it meant once they got to actually putting the projects in place, and that includes the one that's going on right now, people say, well, we're having extensive and lengthy discussions about the sidewalk and their proposals for Toronto, but I think there's a chance by having all that consultation and community involvement, we'll get it right. And that it will be something that will be exciting as opposed to what some people suggest is threatening. And I've seen in the development of our anti-black racism program, which was the first in this country, one of the first in North America, to actually confront that issue and say we're going to have an action plan because we've got a problem here. The program was entirely designed by people from the community. And I could go on with all kinds of examples. The only thing I will say to slightly qualify that is this. I find, and it may be just part of the trend, unfortunately, that's going on in the world, and I so much hope that we can avoid that trend here taking hold, that a lot of the comments of people who are activists, and I don't just say this because I'm an office holder, I saw it when I was out of office, not in office, are becoming increasingly adversarial and polarized. You need people to hold you in check, but I'll tell you the difference between the emails I get from Dr. Wang, for example, about the program and so on, and the difference of some of the communications you get are like night and day. And sure, everybody needs to be sort of held to account, but at the same time, what you really need, since people in government, people in public life do not have perfect answers to these things, is constructive ideas, constructive discussions that often happen inside a room as opposed to over the television or in the newspapers. And that can happen, and that has its role. But I'm just saying, I think in this city, we've got to work harder than ever to make sure that we don't degenerate the discussions into kind of a polarized situation where I think we will get less done to help the very people that everybody is committed to trying to help.
If I can just pick up on what Mayor Tory just said, he's 100% right. The thing I know is this: you've got to have your North Stars. You've got to understand what your values are and try to live your values every single day. And while I believe it's critically important to engage people on the front end of a process, not midstream and certainly not at the back end, you also can't be paralyzed by the critics. It's impossible in government life to please everyone. It just is. And when you and do the engagement, and you have a pretty good sense of what the direction is, you got to forge ahead. You have to forge ahead. Otherwise, you will never get anything done. We're taking on poverty. There are many people in our city that are deeply skeptical to say, Mayor, that's impossible. You can't get rid of poverty in a generation. Maybe we can, maybe we can't. But if you don't start the first steps, if you don't elevate an issue and really try to lay the foundation for a solution, you're never going to be able to move forward. So engagement is critically important, but you can't be bogged down or paralyzed by trying to please every voice in the room.
Thank you. So I have another question from the networks. Maybe this one might be as challenging as the last one for you, but for us it's near and dear to our hearts. It's about the way we approach doing this work together because we are researchers, several of us are, and so we're committed to emerging kind of strong research evidence about what works and how best to implement proven solutions across jurisdictions. So I'm wondering, what is your advice for involving government and municipal leaders in this process?
Well, I think that data-driven strategies are, in my view, always the best. But I will also say it's critically important to have, I think, government as your partner. We've seen in my 10 months in office a number of different efforts that were going on, whether it's in economic development, public health, or other broader public policy issues, where there's been all kinds of studies, analyses that are done that have been relegated to the dustbin of history, in part because they haven't had a willing partner, whether it's at the municipal level or the state level, to say, yes, this is a great idea, and we're going to get behind it. We're not only going to fund it, but we're going to use the bully pulpit of the mayor's office to make it happen. In Chicago, like Toronto, we have great research institutions that are doing incredibly important work that are specific to complex urban environment. But many of those plans have gone nowhere. Many of the warnings that we've gotten from our universities and other research organizations haven't gone anywhere. We're trying to take a completely different approach and embrace our partners in the research world and universities in the academy to partner with us. So a lot of the things that we're doing from a policy perspective, we have university partners who are with us every step of the way, measuring success, analyzing the data, and helping inform the policy and any adjustments that we need to make based upon the data that we're collecting.
I'll just say that, you sort of evolve in these jobs, so whether it's 9 months or in my case now 5 years, and I've come to realize the longer I've had the job, the more important it is to bring people in. We just had an episode recently where we invested millions of new dollars in investment in kids and families for community safety. And we relied a lot on some people we brought in who, one of whom was actually from Chicago and now is our Dean of Social Work here at the U of T. Others, people who've been doing work here for years. And the shape of the programs that we funded with those millions of dollars was, based on advice from them and from other people. I think, again, part of the problem in many cases is unless we're looking at, the news feeds and seeing the studies getting written up, nobody's sort of come to see us. I can't think of an instance in which somebody would ask to come and see me that has written a thoughtful paper or done this kind of research and they want to sort of present it and present some of their ideas where I've said no. But quite often the paper's issued, there's a press conference held, or somebody publishes it somewhere, and you might say, well, then the obligation's on us to kind of look it up and say, well, we'll have those people in. And maybe you're right, but at the end of the day, we don't end up getting together with them. It becomes, in some respects, as I said earlier, more of an adversarial kind of thing as opposed to all hands on deck, which I think was an expression that you used in your talk, Mayor. So there's hardly, these issues are so complex and so intractable and so difficult that you'd be crazy not to use expert research and careful research and facts to make these decisions. But sometimes there's a difficulty in marrying up the people who do that work with the decision makers that happen to be, for example, in government.
Okay. So maybe we'll deal with a specific issue here, again, from our network members. Many cities, not just Chicago and Toronto, in the midst of incredible affluence, are seeing a growing number of their residents become precariously housed and homeless. What role can mayors play in leading effective efforts to create affordable housing in cities? Mayor Tory, do you want to go first?
Well, I think we're at the epicenter of it, in the sense that, you know, we're here on the ground and have, as with many different issues, the responsibility for delivering services to people, regardless of what the involvement of the other governments is. But I would also say, and I'm not sure of the Chicago financial model, although it came up a couple of times in our discussions today, that we cannot do this alone. We do not have the resources or the ability to generate the resources to do it alone. And I will say Adam Vaughan is here. He's been a great partner for Toronto as a member of the federal government, and they have been very supportive in putting forward a national housing strategy. But when we talk about creating supportive housing and affordable housing, and we have a plan now in Toronto, the first time we've had a comprehensive plan like this. I think the total cost is about $27 billion over 10 years. And I raised taxes, and that was something that I had sort of said that I wouldn't do, but I did, because we needed to have the money to build the affordable housing and the supportive housing and the transit. And the federal government has come forward with money from the National Housing Strategy. They have an agreement with the province, but if you said, are we yet in a position where we can do everything we need to do, especially as regards supportive housing, which to me is the area of the most egregious kind of lack? No, we haven't. So I think we can develop and deliver these programs. We can do it in partnership with the other governments. I think we also have a job to do educating people. There's a huge misunderstanding right now about what affordable housing is versus social housing, and as we push forward with the most aggressive program Toronto's had in decades on affordable housing, and it involves having some density near neighborhoods, near transit places. That's logical to have density. There's a misunderstanding of what affordable housing is, what supportive housing is. There's a fear of it to some extent. There's a fear of the density that goes with it, which is not a lot of density, but more than perhaps these neighborhoods are accustomed to. And we need the help of people in this room to, not to cajole, to educate people, to inform people, to go neighborhood by neighborhood with us, to sort of have them understand this is part of what a healthy city requires socially, in terms of making sure it can be a home for everybody, and economically, because frankly we can't afford to have people driven out of the city by a lack of ability to live there because of housing costs. And so we're doing a lot, but when we're doing it in partnership, but those partnerships aren't deep enough or broad enough yet to make sure we get done, especially on supportive housing, all that we need to get done.
Well, I think Mayor Tory's got it exactly right. There is a very specific and I think necessary role for local governments to play in affordability. If people can't afford to live in your city, they're not going to stay and they're not going to come. So it's very basic. I'll give you two examples from Chicago. The neighborhood that I live in the city has been in transition. It's been lots of things over the history of Chicago, but probably more recently, it's been a heavily Puerto Rican neighborhood. The neighborhood is gentrified. I've lived there for now a little over 15 years, and in the arc of my time in the neighborhood, it's gentrified, which in some ways is great because there's a lot more amenities, good restaurants, shopping, and so forth. But what that's meant also is that the people who are long-term residents, particularly the renters, are under terrible stress. The new units that are being built are studio apartments, one bedrooms, maybe two bedrooms, but not units that can actually house families. And so as a consequence, as the neighborhood's fortunes have changed and improved, the long-term residents have been forced out. And part of that has happened because over time, the city of Chicago didn't look at the changing nature of this neighborhood and really try to invest and intervene to make sure that you could stabilize the neighborhood and that, as we say, the development doesn't mean displacement. We're undergoing a very similar kind of stress in the neighborhood where the Obama Presidential Center is going into. This is a very poor neighborhood. It's on the south side, really hasn't seen much in the way of investment. So the Obama Center really provides this incredible opportunity, but we are trying to be much more intentional in making sure that we provide supports and stability for long-term residents so they're not displaced by this economic development. A tale of two neighborhoods, but the difference is city, in the second instance in Woodlawn, is being much more intentional about making sure that we are providing supports through using city-owned property to provide more affordable housing, giving some relief to long-term renters, making sure that homeowners, many of whom are seniors in this particular neighborhood, have resources available to rehabilitate and do maintenance work on their homes, and also making some very specific goals that we will enforce around new development in the area. That's, I think, a role that the city can and must play in order to make sure that long-term residents remain in their neighborhoods.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. For many of the issues that we're tackling, we're trying to move beyond sort of Band-Aid solutions to root causes and prevention, and you mentioned this in your remarks when you talked about violence or poverty or economic development. And this requires long-term commitment beyond 4 years. How important is public opinion for keeping our issues on the agenda as political platforms change? Mayor Lightfoot, would you like to go first?
Well, you know, as I said, I think I'll take the question a little bit differently. I do think it's important to engage the public, particularly when you're talking about making investments of tax dollars. When you want to make a difference in people's lives, engaging them, you learn things. So I talked about the Invest Southwest public forums that we had. We went into it with a certain set of assumptions about what people needed in their neighborhoods, but the number one priority that came out of a lot of these community conversations wasn't more grocery stores, open green spaces. Those were certainly on the list, but the number one thing that people cited was pedestrian safety. We never thought about that other than engaging with folks. But the politics can certainly get in the way. And that's why I said, you know, I'm fortunate that I didn't kind of come up through a party system. My election was a little bit like seeing a unicorn. I was not supposed to win. I was up against people who were better known, had more resources. But I think what people voted for in sending me to office was they wanted change. They wanted something that wasn't the same old, same old. And that's the kind of thing that that really I think has freed us up to be true to the mandate that we were given, but to take on tough, seemingly intractable problems without worrying about the political consequences. Now, I'd be lying to you to say I don't concern myself with politics. Of course I do, and both, you know, party politics, but also small p politics, because that just is part of the nature of the beast. But I'm guided by, I hope, every single day what my values are, and making sure that we are moving forward with data-tested solutions that engage the residents in building capacity. So long after people forget that somebody named Lori Lightfoot was the mayor of Chicago, that we're going to have lasting solutions and infrastructure, but also the nature in which we govern. I want to raise people's expectations about what they should and can expect and demand from public officials. And that means that we have to really be very intentional in engaging with people in long-term solutions.
Thank you very much.
You know, it's a fascinating question, and I entirely endorse every word that Mayor Lightfoot said in her own answer. And I like to think of myself as being in public life at this stage for the same reasons, but you cannot divorce politics from, no matter whether you're staying around, not staying around, whether you care whether you're reelected or not, because the reality is in our system, I don't think from our brief discussion about this today, yours is much different. We don't have any parties at the City Hall. I'm talking city politics or city government here. We don't have any parties at City Hall. And so if you get too far out in front of the public, they can lose confidence in you, or more importantly, lose confidence in some of your ideas, and they will influence their city councilors, and that will create a situation where a lot of the things you might want to move forward just won't move forward at all. And so I'm very comfortable in defending a process of incremental change, so that we were talking a little bit today about supervised injection sites. We were talking, I look at pedestrian safety the same way. There were changes that absolutely sensibly needed to be made in the City of Toronto with regard to speed limits, for example. But it's an issue that has very strong opinions on a number of different sides, and the research work would say, well, the more you can bring speed limits down to more reasonable kinds of numbers, the more lives you will save. Well, and we've done that incrementally. We didn't do a blanket one time, one day, but we've made hundreds of speed limit changes across the city to move them down, and it's going to be saving lives. But I think you have to deal with the art of the possible, and because in the event you bring something forward that is too far ahead of where the public is, they will simply reflect that onto their city councilors, and those kinds of things won't get done. So I think this notion that you can sort of come into a job like this, and there are people in this room that have had these jobs, and get way out in front of the public and way out in front of your colleagues, by the way, who either in a parliament or in the city council have to support what you're doing, is a prescription for paralysis. And some people get frustrated by by a more incremental kind of approach, but that is the art of the possible in bringing change about it. So I think it's possible to bring about change, and I think if you look at where we are on poverty reduction strategy and all the different measures that have been brought in the last 5 years, or on pedestrian safety and the things we've done that 5 years ago nobody would have done, they wouldn't have just had the gumption to sort of suggest it was possible to do it in a city where there's still a kind of a divide between some of the outlying areas and the downtown. Is that the price to be paid for getting those things done is incremental change as opposed to radical change? Because if it's radical change, you'll feel good about it and you'll get positive headlines for 20 minutes and you'll be gone and the change will be gone with you, because there'll be a reaction that comes to that kind of radical change that will produce a government that is, committed to actually stopping and not doing a lot of the things you said you were doing. So that's, and the nice thing is we're both held to account for what we do. It's an unusual kind of job. Others in this room have had those jobs. And 4 years, or in my case, 2.5, in your case, I guess it's almost 3.5, people will have their judgment to render, and that's fine. You fully accept that.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your remarks.
Thank you.